Then we will dive right into a discussion with Deb Gist, Commissioner of Education, Rhode Island, Mark Murphy, Secretary of Education in Delaware. I think you can tell which is which. Both belong to the dynamic and awesome Chiefs for Change organization and are on the front lines of education reform and governance. Each is in charge of both helming and paddling, I would say right now, their state education agency. So we shall see if they still want to do that at the end of this conversation. Thanks for joining us here in the live audience. We're being live streamed to a worldwide audience of millions. Those watching from the worldwide audience can tweet us questions at hashtag HelmNotOr. Hashtag HelmNotOr. We're also going to have an innovation, which is a couple of videoed questions coming in the middle of our conversation, though I will admit to the studio audience that those were pre-recorded by people who got an early look at the contents of the paper. So without further ado, Julie is going to commence and Andy is going to finish a brief presentation of what this paper says.
Thanks, Checker. All right. So Andy and I are really excited to be here today to present our report on state education agencies. Before I dive in, I just want to thank the Fordham Institute for hosting the event. And for being such thoughtful collaborators throughout this entire project. So thank you, Checker and Mike and Amber, for their help on this. You all know that SEAs are currently playing a central role in a wide range of education reform initiatives, from Common Core to educator evaluation, school improvement grants, everything. So at the same time, we've also seen delays. We've seen some scaled back deliverables, and we've seen some disappointing results. So when we see promising reforms falter, we have to ask why. Andy and I consider this question through the framework proposed in the 1993 book, Reinventing Government, by David Osborne and Ted Gabler, in which they argue that government should steer rather than row. So historically, the SEA developed to primarily support local education agencies. After the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, they were tasked with monitoring and distributing federal dollars. Since that time, SEAs have gradually become sort of the default agent of change for initiatives concocted at the federal and the state level. But they're struggling in their new role. Race to the Top states have received dozens of extensions on their deadlines, most recently receiving an extra year to complete their work, several of them. Common Core implementation has proven to be intensive and a complex endeavor. Even when SEAs have the best laid implementation plans, politics can swoop in at any time and throw a curveball. Assessments, educator evaluations, and state takeovers have also been marred by challenges in capacity, in adaptability, and in process. I want to be really clear, though, in saying that SEA's struggles are not for the lack of commitment and effort by their leaders. When SEAs are successful, and they have been at times, it's due to the grit and the cage-busting leadership of leaders like Deborah and Mark. What we propose is that SEAs struggle because they simply weren't built to do what's being asked of them. So we identified 5 major brick walls that SEAs face when they attempt to lead reform initiatives. The first is human capital. In order to have successful implementation, you need the right people in the right positions. But state chiefs face numerous barriers when building their teams, from civil service requirements to uncompetitive salaries to lengthy hiring processes. They also face procurement issues. Not only does the length and complexity of the procurement process create significant delays for SEAs, but rules meant to prevent corruption can actually end up undermining the quality of the outcome. Third, the rulemaking process is often lengthy and cumbersome. So processes to ensure stakeholder feedback and transparency are completely appropriate for public accountability, but they're not well suited to efforts that require flexibility and mid-course corrections. Fourth, even when the right human capital is in place, even when implementation plans are thoughtful and thorough, politics can throw SEAs a curveball, and it has. Finally, institutional sclerosis. So it is difficult for any established organization to pivot effectively. A small startup can accelerate, decelerate, turn on a dime like a speedboat, right? In comparison, an SEA is the Queen Mary. It has developed over time for compliance and monitoring, and that comes with an awful lot of inertia. So SEAs simply were not designed to pursue the implementation of reforms. Instead of asking SEAs to do more and to do it better, instead of asking SEAs to do more to build their capacity and reshape their organizations into what we wish they could be, we think the SEA should step aside and let other organizations step up. What Osborne and Gabler would call rowing less and steering more. So we can think about this and how it can be done through what we are calling the 4 C's model. And Andy is going to walk us through it.
Thank you, Julie.
Hopefully quickly.
Darn right.
Okay, I will hustle. So the question, if we put it pretty straightforwardly, is this. If we believe that this state ought to get out of the business of rowing so much and into the business of steering much more, how in the world do we scale back the SEA in such a way that it can do what it needs to do while at the same time allowing this burgeoning new sector to develop? And like Julie said, voila. We've come up with this catchy 4C model, the approach of the 4 Cs. Hopefully you can see this. And so what we would like you to do is think about the activities and authorities of the State Department of Education along this continuum. On one end, you can think of where the department ought to be strong and active, things that a government just ought to do that ought to be centralized. In the middle are a set of activities that maybe the department should do, like have a hand in, but not necessarily own and operate. On the other end, where the department ought to be weak, inactive, probably shouldn't be involved at all. And so as we thought about this, we came up with 4 ways of thinking of it. On the far side of like where the government ought to be strong, where it's pretty clear that a centralized government unit ought to be in control of making sure important stuff gets done, we say control. In the middle, where the government could be involved, make sure things get done while allowing others to do it, we say contract, enable others to get the work done. On the far side, where it's not really clear the SEA should be involved at all, we say cleave, cut it off, allow other organizations to do it. Now, this isn't just some like scary privatization, scale down the government scheme. We're cognizant that as we're saying that the government shifts down, we need to shift up elsewhere. And that's why the last C, which I consider the most interesting, is create, which means create the state-level reform ecosystem of nonprofit, non-government, mostly organizations that can pick up the slack while the SEA steps back. And we're going to talk more about this. So just to go quickly through the 4 Cs. The first one is C, control. What is it that the SEA ought to do? What is its core competency? So our view is the things that are comprehensive statewide that really require transparency, centralization, government authority are the things that the SEA should focus on like it did 10, 20, 30 years ago. A couple examples. State and federal funding. Funded through the State Department of Education, make sure it gets to the right places and is being used well. Standards and assessments. What kids learn, how they're tested. It affects all schools, all districts, all kids. Makes sense for it to be done by the government. Like the SDLS, those of us in this world, statewide longitudinal data systems, collect all this information. Makes sense for that to be in the department as well. And lastly, there are a bunch of federal and state rules related to Title I, special education, Perkins Act. You need a central repository to do this. So again, we're not saying the department does nothing. We're saying focus on the things that it can do well. C, I had to use this quote. This is from the former head of CCSSO, the Superintendents Association, who's former chief of Kentucky. When we were talking to him about this, he put into a very pithy paragraph what we were thinking. That is, the state has a core set of responsibilities. Set expectations for the system, set measures for accountability, ensure money is getting out and is well used, federal funds are distributed properly, full stop. Everything after that, as far as the SEA is concerned, becomes questionable. And this is the former head of the Association of State Superintendents agreeing in principle. C2 is contract. The activities that require accountability, but the SEA, because of lack of capacity, lack of money, lack of flexibility, can't do well. Imagine Common Core implementation. Rather than all of the SEAs trying to hire all the best people with all their Byzantine rules related to hiring, why not put out an RFP, say we want to help third grade reading or high school math, get a wide array of nonprofits to apply, judge their proposals, sign performance contracts, and then judge them along the way, making sure they get the job done. You can see how this affects the credentialing of educators as well. Rather than the State Department of Education having 200 people sorting through applications and deciding who gets certification, say to the nonprofit sector, you guys decide how this work gets done. We're just going to set the goals, and then we're going to evaluate you every 3-5 years, deciding whether or not you're actually producing the teachers we need. That's a long-term initiative. You can imagine short-term, and this might be the most important, because state departments of education are kind of like dogs who are out in a field on a windy day. Like the state says, let's do this, and dog runs and chases after a leaf. Oh, there's a squirrel, let me chase after that. Oh, look, a rabbit, let me chase after that. These departments are so, let's say, sclerotic. It's hard for them to shift on a dime. So when you go from Common Core implementation to teacher evaluation, implementation to whatever the next reform du jour is, you need to be able to shift from one thing to another. And if you have a set of contracts that can lapse, a great state chief can say, we're going to do this for 3 years and this for 3 years, as opposed to accreting a set of staff and responsibilities within the organization. Let me quickly go through CLEAVE, because this list, and we go through it extensively in the report. There are certain things that the department just shouldn't do. Charter authorizing, we think, is a classic example. If you're a department that's set up to assess districts and schools based on inputs, based on rules, that's totally different than setting up new schools that run autonomously and you're going to judge them based on outcomes. To do one doesn't mean you can do the other. Same thing with education innovation. I won't belabor this point. Departments are many things, but nimble and innovative aren't really one of them. To say that they're going to be in the position of identifying great things that are happening and being able to figure out the big breakthroughs and spread them, I think that's better done in the nonprofit sector. The last C is create. Our view here is that state-level actors need to get into the business of figuring out what reforms need to be done and then growing this burgeoning nonprofit sector to get it done. So quickly, our view here is that this nonprofit sector is going to be an analog to what we're seeing in cities, where the district shrinks and then the new nonprofit sector with human capital providers and with facilities aides and with TA providers is growing as the district shrinks. Some of these organizations at the state level could focus on one issue like teacher prep, many issues like a range of TA. You could see a fluid ecosystem where organizations come in and out of vogue, but also out of power as priorities change. And this one is the most important because it segues into the last little minute I have here, which is what we're seeing is that this ecosystem is going to create a set of organizations with different relationships with the State Department of Education, some closely tied to it and some very independent. The most exciting part for me of this paper, doing it, is we had this hypothesis that this blue thing was possible when in fact it's already happening under our noses. And what we just did in the last quarter is catalog it. So if you think about this continuum of nonprofit or non-government organizations, actually including organizations with different relationships with the State Department of Education, on one far end you can have tightly connected, on the other end they're fully independent. And the four that we talk about in the paper are the Louisiana Recovery School District, a newly created state entity with a single purpose but not part of the SEA. The New York Regents Research Fund, technically a nonprofit organization, but tied to the hip of the SEA. The Colorado Education Initiative, truly a nonprofit organization. It's kind of a hybrid. It has some direct ties with the SEA. Then you have the Tennessee SCORE, which is truly independent, more of an advocacy organization. In the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly talk about the Louisiana Recovery School District and end with the Colorado Education Initiative, which until about a week ago was called the Colorado Legacy Fund. Louisiana Recovery School District. Now think in terms of like how Julie laid this out. If we recognize that SEA can't do things, you can see the RSD was a classic example of the state getting smart, saying that there's been a long history of departments taking over districts and taking over schools and not being able to fix them. The state said, fine, we're going to take that away from the SEA and create a new entity to do it. Single-purpose, fixed low-performing schools. It began by directly running some and then turning some into charters. As of this fall, all of the schools it has taken over will be charters, the first all-charter district in America. But the point here is the state decided it couldn't do something through the SEA, found a single purpose, created a new organization to do it, and it's succeeding quite well. The last is the Colorado Education Initiative. It was started by state leaders who said, Colorado has all these awesome plans, has new legislation, but let's be honest, there's no way it's going to be able to carry out its broad ambitions. How do we start an organization to be a helping hand? So CEI is the helping hand of the department. It works alongside the SEA on teacher eval reform, Common Core implementation, a wide range of other things. Interestingly, it's a 501c3, so it's independent, and it calls itself a critical friend. It helps you, the department most of the time, criticizes it sometimes. But 3 of its board seats are actually ex officio, the lieutenant governor, the state superintendent, and a member of the state board. So technically it's separate, but really, you know, they're married-ish. And there's also an MOU between the department and the CEI. Last point I'll pick out, because I see some former or current philanthropists in the room. This is really interesting. Most philanthropists, I'd love to hear your views on this, don't like giving money to state agencies, particularly SEAs, because they don't know where the money goes. It gets wrapped up in procurement processes. But for philanthropists who think state-level reform is important, if they can funnel the money through an affiliated nonprofit, knowing it won't get tied up in bureaucracy, knowing they get the tax write-off of it, CEI and others are becoming a conduit, a magnet for private philanthropy to help drive state-level reform. So in conclusion, we're not saying SEAs should go away. We're saying they are simply limited. They can do a certain set of things well, and we should enable them to do that. But let's be honest about what their capacity is. So from now on, when we have a new state job to do, rather than defaulting and say, let's hand it to the SEA, let's ask 3 questions. Is it something the SEA must do? Is it something the SEA should be involved in but could enable others to do it? Or is it something that the SEA doesn't have to get its fingers in at all? Through our research, we've come to the conclusion that many more things are going to fall into buckets 2 and 3 than currently we're doing, which is just give it all to the SEA. So the final formula I'd like to have you think about is, and I'm stealing this term from my dear friend Nirav Kingsland, I hope he's watching, relinquishment. If we can get state leaders who typically like to have power and authority to relinquish some of their power and say that this isn't about the SEA, this is about the best interest of the states and kids, give up power, at the same time say we are going to create this nonprofit sector to do the rest of the work, we go down, it goes up. Hopefully what we think is we can create a new environment at the state level where we have the government lead and coordinate this dynamic collection of non-government entities with the collective responsibility to drive reform and hopefully continuously improve what we do at the state level. That's our story. We're sticking to it. Thank you for the time.
Can I move this?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Andy and Julie. We're going to forgive the word married-ish.
From a happily married man.
And we're going to assume that he's referring to something other than hooking up. I think this is a really interesting moment. I don't think it's just Andy getting revenge on the New Jersey State Department of Education, where for a couple of productive years he was the deputy commissioner. And I'm not going to play Andy psychiatrist to try to understand what deep-seated resentments may lurk in his soul. I see this more as analogous to 20 years ago, the dawn of the charter school movement. Very loosely speaking, I think what Andy and Julie are proposing for states is analogous to what the people who thought up charter schooling were doing with districts. Which is to say, the district doesn't have to educate all the kids in its public education system itself. There are a lot of charter schools today. There are even now some so-called portfolio districts that incorporate charters and other schools of choice within a very different management structure. I sort of think that what Andy and Julie are proposing could be described as sort of portfolio states. In which state leaders, through a variety of organizational mechanisms, engage in the education and education reforming of the kids and schools in their state. Now, this may be a far-fetched analogy, but in my head, it works. And I think it'll be very interesting to see it play out. But let's go to the let's go immediately to Deb and Mark with the sort of fundamental question here, which is: have Andy and Julie diagnosed an actual ailment? Or are they inventing one? Are state education agencies overstretched, asked to do too much, put upon with things that are not within their capacity to do? So before we get to remedies, let's talk about the illness. Is there one? Deb, then Mark.
Well, I mean, I think certainly because of the urgency of the work that all of us are involved in education, I mean, it's critical. These are lives in the balance. These are generations of kids whose education is depending on us. So overstretched, I mean, we stretch ourselves. There's no question about that. At the Rhode Island Department of Education, we've organized ourselves in a way to accomplish our goals. And it's interesting because on the one hand, when I read the report and hear the conversation, I sort of feel the pain of what it's like to manage a bureaucratic organization or a state organization. On the other hand, I think, well, it's not that bad. I mean, it's not as if we can't get anything done or everything takes months and months and years. I mean, it's just not. I think the safeguards that are in place, and I'll also say that I think all states are different. And I certainly, in conversations with my colleagues, I think different states have different kinds of constraints and multiple steps they have to go through that we're fortunate to not have quite as many of those. But with that said, if there are functions that we're responsible for that could be better handled by someone else, absolutely should happen. The only thing that I'm concerned about is getting the work done as effectively and efficiently as possible so that we can best serve kids. And so with that, I agree with the underlying message of let's get the best people organized to get the work done.
Okay. Mark, how does it look from Delaware, where I noted just the other day you all sought and got a 5th-year extension on your Race to the Top grant? Which may be because the federal government was unrealistic in thinking it could get done in 4 years, or maybe because the state of Delaware can't get it done in 4 years.
We can get the work done, and we're on our way to getting there. So we're working with our partners at USED to make sure that happens. If you read the first, I think this is 40 pages in front of everybody here in the audience, and if you read the first 20, it sounds like we've got a heck of a problem on our hands.
Yes.
So I'm glad the second 20 exists. I think the question around the ailment is a question about how we are orienting to the work. And so if we take the orientation, as Deb noted, about how do we most efficiently and effectively deliver for our children, then I think that naturally brings you to a place of the 4 C's, or of partnering with people, or of making sure that we are able to shift our orientation towards outcomes as a state education agency. So the ailment in Delaware, I don't believe is as was described necessarily in the paper. I think that if we wanted to name the ailment, it's that how do we do this work as effectively and as efficiently? How do we get from point A to point B? If you assume that SEAs look similarly to what is described in the paper, then how do you move to this next generation of SEAs that are maybe not as nimble, but are obviously behaving in ways that are more oriented towards outcomes, more oriented towards partnerships, and excited about an ecosystem that can wrap around an SEA. So I would love to have that conversation about what these coming years look like, so that we can land in a place where the outcomes for kids are delivered in a much better way.
So neither of you is actually disagreeing with the proposition that some of the work can and should be done by others.
I think I quibble with a few of the specific recommendations about which should be in which category, but generally speaking, we all ought to have the attitude, whether we're in the federal government or state government or school districts or whatever, that it ought to be about how do we best get the work done while being good stewards of taxpayer dollars. I mean, as noted in the report, some of the controls that are in place for good reasons, and we need to be cautious about that. But other than that, what most people who are out there as part of the public want is the same thing that we want, which is let's just get this done and let's get it done well.
You agree with that?
I do. I do.
So, Andy, what about I'm just going to call it quality control in this mix? Without saying that SEAs do a terrific job of getting everything done with perfection, let's acknowledge that every sort of outsourcing and teaming up and chartering and so on agreement leads to bad apples getting into the barrel.
That's right.
We got a lot of mediocre charter schools. We got some outsourced garbage collection that is making some people rich but not doing a very good job of collecting garbage. This is not a foolproof formula for everything getting done efficiently and conscientiously and inexpensively.
That's right.
So how in this package proposition do you manage the control of quality by the entities which are not the SEA?
Well, this is such a good question that Julie and I did a lot of hand-wringing about it, and we dedicated what almost feels like a postscript, a coda onto the paper that ended up being 2, 3, 4 pages just on the subject alone. Because although we're both amenable to the idea of like a nimble quasi-market structure would probably be the best one to be both adaptable quickly, but also if you give consumers choice, like districts and schools, it's going to meet the needs of all the consumers that are involved. But we are cognizant of the fact that markets do have these downsides, that you can have low performers, and if you don't conscientiously cull them, they are going to do wrong by kids and cause a lot of expense and so forth. So what we began by looking at is that there are states who have tried to dispossess them at the central office level of certain functions. And some of you may be familiar with BOCES, so like state almost appendages that work out in the field doing different services, and there are different gradations of this. And some of them are succeeding, and there's a little bit of research on which are good and which are not. We came to the conclusion that the charter model of clear expectations of outcomes, and then performance contracts, and then assiduous monitoring, and then like the back-end accountability of deciding, yes, we thought you were going to do a great job, TFA, TNTP, name your other kind of alternate certification provider. We thought you were going to be good on the front end. We've assessed you, you're not good. Sorry, you no longer have that contract. So our hope is that the department could be good because it does have the DNA structure of monitoring compliance, making sure rules are being followed. If you add to that performance contracts, making sure that results are there, we think that it could be in the position of making sure that those who participate, to the extent you can weed out bad ones on the front end, predictably bad ones, and weed out bad ones on the back end, that you can actually have a good market.
Is that realistic?
Yeah, I'd love to build on that. I think that that goes to the heart and soul of what you're trying to accomplish in a SEA in regards to job descriptions and who you're hiring. And there's this really interesting quandary for us is that you want to hire people who understand schools and understand how school districts work and have that perspective and are have credibility in the field with supporting people and having conversations even about what this work looks like in classrooms and in districts. And at the same time, you've got to have an incredible core competency around negotiating and managing contracts, and then an outcomes orientation towards the management of those contracts, which can sometimes be fundamentally different than the input orientation that has existed over time. So the hiring process at an SEA becomes quite challenging for many of the reasons Andy mentioned, but I would also say that it would be well worth the time to start fleshing out job descriptions as examples of things that we want to make sure we are hiring for, and contracting and outcomes orientation and an outcomes management process is right at the top of my list.
Deb, talk a bit about the quality control challenge on the things that you might engage others to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about actually one of the projects that we did with our Race to the Top grant, and we contracted out and worked with the vendor, and the vendor really dropped the ball. And it threw us for a loop, and we ended up coming up with a different solution and brought a lot of it back in-house, to be honest with you. And so I think that not everything always works better if someone else is doing it. And you know, we can't just say, okay, well, because they're not the state government, they're going to automatically be able to do it, you know, more effectively. That's just not the case. And so the quality control is critically important, and you know, being able to set up the right contracts and having the skill set to know how to do that well, having consistent project management systems that are in place and performance management that's in place. Those are all things that we have to do when we set those systems in place, especially if you are moving to the farther right-hand side of the proposal to the Cleve area.
Can I add one thing to this? Like, I think just in terms of a data point that if you haven't worked in SEA, you might not be aware of, and I was not aware of when I went in. Had I been aware, I may not have gone in.
Now you're out.
Maybe not a coincidence. I saw on one of my first days, I asked how many people work for the State Department. I was told somewhere between 700 and 800. I thought, you know, this is serious bandwidth here. We can get some things done. And then the administrative officer started laughing. And I said, what's so funny? And he said, well, keep in mind, 180 of them work for our school for the deaf. They're not here. They have a very specific certification. They're really not part of the department, but they're on our rolls. I said, great. Okay, so we're down to, let's call it 500-600-ish. I said, okay, great. So we can move these folks around to do what's in our set of priorities. And he said, about 75% of them are federally funded. I said, come again? He said, well, they are funded by Title I, most of them, meaning they can only do Title I aligned activities. About another half of those are assigned to IDEA, federally funded. They can only do federally funded special education activities. We also have some folks who are working on the Perkins Grant, CTE. They can only work on those things. So I said, okay, how many people are not part of that? He gave me a number. And then I said, okay, how many of those are non-unionized? Because once you come in, if you're a third grade reading specialist, you have a priority to do third grade reading. 5 years later, you don't, that's not a priority anymore, but you're now unionized and you get to keep your job. So how many actual people of these 800 can we put bodies toward for our new priorities? And he smiled and said, 20-ish, give or take. One of the reasons why we have to be thoughtful about whether or not we bring things in-house are these rules that were put in place for many very good reasons about protecting jobs and civil service and on and on and on. But the hands that are tied behind your back, you just can't underestimate. And so we constantly found ourselves asking this question: how do we put bodies towards our priorities, especially given that if you go to the state legislature and say, hey, can I have another couple $1 million so I can hire 20 more staff? What does the state legislature say? If I'm going to appropriate $20 more million, am I giving it to the State Department of Education?
That's just overhead.
Overhead. We're going to give that to districts and schools so it can go straight to the classroom. So we were moving around deck chairs, and we found, like, when we had to develop our teacher evaluation office under Race to the Top, we were trying to find people from around the department who knew anything about teacher evaluation. And great people, lots of skill sets. Knowing about teacher evaluation wasn't part of that skill set.
I think, may I?
I want a factual answer first. Approximately how many people did you and Chris Cerf get to hire from outside the agency in, let's say, the first 6 months? 5? 50?
Somewhere in between, give or take, and forgive me, no one quote me on this, 20-ish, probably.
20-ish.
And that required some moving stuff around and stuff you have to do in the government.
Approximately how many sort of people have each of you been able to bring in from outside the agency that you inherited?
Well, first of all, I mean, I've been able to bring in a handful. We're really small. I mean, we only have about 130 people in our department. But the other thing is that there are incredibly talented and hardworking people throughout my organization, including whether they're union members or we have multiple unions that are a part of the agency. And so we can't just write off
That's right.
those
Everybody
folks
who's
because
there.
maybe historically they weren't asked to do certain things or assume that they're not capable. And there's no question that sometimes it takes a moment for people to readjust and get on board or whatnot, but that can be done. And when you're ready, I want to respond to what
I just want to ask Mark about the sort of the personnel situation. How many people work in the Delaware department, approximately?
Approximately 200, but you know, as Andy was mentioning, we have like all the driver's education teachers report to the department, but let's say about 200.
And what about new hires on your watch?
So I want to be clear about one thing. These are not additional hires. We're not growing the department,
okay.
And we've committed to not doing that.
The legislature appreciates that. So do the taxpayers.
Our taxpayers, right? And our schools and our educators and our children, ultimately. But what we have actually been very successful in hiring, and so we have seen, you know, resignations and we've seen retirements. And when we have hired, we feel incredibly good about those hires. They have often taken us a very long time, and to Andy's point, a lot of that comes down to grit and perseverance. But we have been very successful in hiring.
Approximately how many people?
30.
Okay. Deb, go ahead with what you wanted to say.
So I think the point about the management of federal funds is that you just raised is something that is missed in the report, in that that is an area where when we're talking about state education agencies, how we've always done our work and how we ought to do our work differently, that's a whole area that is ripe for this conversation. And it's a conversation that it's changes that we've been making and conversations that we're having now about how we can do that work much more effectively than we have been in the past, much more focused on making sure that those dollars are serving districts so that they can serve students more effectively. And just to give a quick example, in the management of our Race to the Top grant, one of the things that we had to do was to put in a monitoring plan for how we were going to monitor our school districts. And we could have very easily said, you know, the typical kind of monitoring, we're going to require them to do this monthly report, we're going to have someone who, you know, checks off the boxes to make sure they all did it, we're going to give reports back or something like that. And what we decided to do was to set up a process that we call collaborative learning for outcomes. And it's essentially professional learning communities for our districts, for our LEAs, so it includes our charter schools. And we didn't just assign them to a group. We didn't just do that geographically or something like that. A lot of them kind of ended up being geographic anyway, but they sort of self-selected into these small groups, and we gave them a chance to self-assess, to discuss, to share practices, and that was our monitoring. And we've learned a lot from that process, and we're very much hoping to be able to take some of the aspects of that and look back at our monitoring of other federal funds and see how we can do that in a way that's more of a service to the districts.
Is it fair to say that you and Julie sort of took the federal pieces of this as fixed rather than malleable in terms of both the uses of funds and the uses of personnel who are funded?
Yes and no. We pushed as much as we could, and we had often conversations with the U.S. Department of Education, and to their great credit, and this is one thing I give Arnie Duncan enormous credit for and his team, they bent over backwards to enable us to do things within law and within guidance that we could that may have seemed out of the norm, especially with the staffing. One interesting story, and this goes with...
You're talking New Jersey now.
When I was at New Jersey,
okay.
When we had to ask for permission to do things. To, I think, Deborah's point and the Rick Hess point about cage-busting leadership, just a quick anecdote. Chris Surf, when he was the commissioner, in a meeting, was upset about how we were spending special education IDEA funds. And he said, let's create an incentive program where we actually set an award, a contest, and we give $1 million to the district that does the best, has the most academic growth with special education kids. And I started laughing out loud. Like, you just don't do that. You can't do that. That's not what IDEA was meant to be. You know, we'll be sued, and the department will now have these files leveled against us. You just don't do that. And Chris Surf, being a cage buster, was like, no, we're going to try it. And so he pushed and he pushed and he pushed, and we had a great assistant commissioner in this area, and she pushed and she pushed, and I will be damned if a year later we didn't have an award where we gave grants to, and it turned out to be districts and I think even schools, that made the best growth of special education kids, both in absolute and proficiency numbers, using IDEA funds, which is something that is completely not contemplated if you read the statute itself, but I don't know if it was some combination of looking the other way, the department helping us, but we set a new context in the state for saying this money just isn't formula-based, do whatever you want with it. What we want to see is growth. What we want to see is change. But it took us a year, and I don't know how many dozens, hundreds of man hours to make that happen, which gets me back to the point of, yes, we got it done, yes, we busted cages, but could have we done the same thing in the nonprofit sector, got the same results with a much smaller amount of investment of resources?
Okay. Mark, you referred a minute ago to the feds as, I think you used the word partners, something like that, with regard to Race to the Top. Have they been partners with respect to your uses of federal funds and personnel and federally funded personnel?
Yes, I think they have been, and I think they continue to be. And so we have a constant relationship on a daily basis on the phone with our friends at USAID. So that exists. And that being said, we certainly need some cage busting in this arena. And to Andy's point, it sometimes takes months and unfortunately years to achieve some of the things that we're hoping to achieve.
So I'm sort of reminded of the many articles about cage busting school principals who I've sometimes described as mavericks who run great schools, but it's against all the rules. Yeah. They run great schools even though they're supposed to be doing things otherwise than the way they're doing them. You're all describing, at least in your examples, a kind of a maverick behavior rather than this is the way it's set up and supposed to work. Am I right?
I'd love to touch on that.
Please.
Yeah, me too.
I don't think it's maverick behavior. I think it's how we orient towards this work. And so for me, there's three prongs here. There's a prong of you have to set the bar high in terms of your expectations for quality on the front end. So you don't just want to open the floodgates and let people do whatever they want to do. You have to set a bar high on quality. Secondly, you have to clear the path for the regulations and the rules and stuff that get in the way. And that's something that an SEA should be able to do. We should be able to work on the regulations and clear that stuff out. Work with the legislature on the code to help things like teacher evaluation systems like we're doing in Delaware right now. But a third is, and this goes to Andy's point around the ecosystem, is that if you don't have people who are willing to take those steps and be innovative and set a bar high and walk through that now open door, then this whole thing kind of falls apart, and then you wind up back in a role where an SEA is oriented towards trying to do the work themselves. And so that third prong, having the people in the ecosystem who are willing to take those innovative steps, is not something that we should just take for granted that exists.
Well, that's part of why he uses the word create for building some things that don't necessarily exist. I know Delaware just a little bit. I know you've got some of those kinds of organizations in Delaware. I don't know how well Rhode Island is supplied with them. But speak to the maverick issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important that we have cage busters at every level. And, if there are people that need to break rules in order to get things done more effectively, it's our job to look at what rules are having to be broken, whether those are the right rules, and how we need to change them. And I think that the fact that we now have a lot of state chiefs who are cage busters and who are focused on making more dramatic, more significant change in our schools is a really positive thing. And it finally gets to where we can say, what is the role of the state agency in all of this work? And importantly, what is the role of policy? And what are the things that we can do that we're uniquely positioned to do? So one of the things that is mentioned in the report is the hedgehog concept of Jim Collins. And one of the most important questions I think that's asked in that hedgehog thing is, what are we uniquely positioned to do? And one of the things that this SEA is uniquely positioned to do is to change policy. No, state legislators can do that and so forth, but in Rhode Island in particular, my board, when they set a regulation, it holds the force of law. So they are a law-making entity. And so there is so much that we can do to change things, improve things, and pave the way for those cage busters throughout the rest of the system. And hopefully they can be cage busting on things that don't require them to break rules that we've created that are inappropriate or ineffective.
Do you want to explain the Isaiah Berlin allusion? Here, I believe it involves foxes and hedgehogs.
I don't remember that.
Okay, where did you get it at, with the hedgehog?
Oh, we definitely put the hedgehog thing in here. I mean, yeah, it's I steal liberally from Jim Collins all the time. But
You stole from Isaiah Berlin.
I
Okay.
didn't know
Yes,
that.
all right, never mind.
No, but go to the hedgehog and the cage busting thing. Again, a little anecdote.
Cage busting hedgehog. All right, keep going.
Yes, bear with me. When I started participating in the board meetings of PARC, because New Jersey was a member and my boss wasn't able to go, I was just astounded at, and forgive me for sounding like a sycophant, but I would sit at this table and there were people like Deborah Gist and Tony Bennett and Kevin Huffman and Paul Pasterak and Hannah Scandera and more around the table, like the best of the best, who had gone into their jobs presumably for the same reason I did in 2010, which was I had this view that we were in the race of the top era, that for however long it lasted, state departments of education were going to be the leaders in education reform. And I went there, and I think we got some good stuff done, but I couldn't stop thinking, why is this so hard? And then Rick Hess's book came out, Cage Busting Leadership, arguing that we need more people to be cage busters. And after reading it and thinking about this experience, I came to a different conclusion. The problem isn't that we're developing too few cage busting leaders. The problem is we're putting too many leaders in cages. What happens if we had Kevin and Deborah and Chris Cerf and John King and John White, these remarkable figures?
Maybe even Mark.
Mark, who wasn't part of PARC at the time, who I believe you are now?
No, we're at Smarter Balanced.
Okay. And I'm sure there are many great chiefs who would be on this list. I'm smart about this as well. The point being, if they are so good, it seems like for some reason we have this this complex where we think that there is utility in doing work that is hard by virtue of being hard. Why not just get these great people and put them, another Jim Collins saying is, always put your best people never on the worst circumstances, always put them in the best conditions. You're going to get much more out of them when you put them in a fertile field as opposed to trying to fix up something. And for some reason, all of us, I don't know if we're victims or something, we say, we got to go in there and we got to fix this. Stop being cage busters. Go someplace where there's not a cage. And that's sort of the genesis of this paper.
So some of the cages, the constraints are caused by regulations and procedures and so on that are within your control. But some of them, many of them, I think, tell me if this is wrong, are caused by forces more or less outside your control. State procurement rules and state civil service rules and state salary schedules and federal requirements and regulations of one kind or another. It's one thing to sort of modify the practices, procedures, and regulations that you can modify, but what sort of fraction of the total constraints, organizational constraints, are within your power to do anything about? And which ones involve wheedling legislators or federal friends, as Mark calls them, or others to change in order to enable you to even move the cage?
I mean, the majority are within our control. And even those that aren't within our control are probably within our influence. And I think that our colleagues, wherever they are often more than willing to make the improvements that need to be made, whether it's at the U.S. Department of Education or elsewhere within state government. And when they're not, the only thing you can do is improve your system internally up until you get to that point. And the good news is that there's a lot that needs to be done differently there, so there's plenty of room to streamline and get things done more effectively and so forth. So we have a lot more control than we oftentimes recognize. We do have the ability to make change.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's a bunch of excuses.
Bunch of excuses.
Yeah.
That's definitely true. Often I found from program staff, who, as we write in the report, several people told us, former state chiefs, that because there are some program staff who are funded by federal programs, they are much more loyal to the federal dollars that keep them paid than they are to whatever kind of revolving set of commissioners come through. And so often they can be, for self-preservation reasons, or just historical ways of doing things, the ones who tell you that things can't be done. And then you have to get lawyers involved and the governor's counsel's office and decide what actually is true and what isn't. I think Dan Weisberg is a great example of this now at TNTP at the New York City Department of Education, worked for Joel Klein, who a big chunk of his job was figuring out what did all the lawyers tell people in the past that weren't necessarily true? How many more degrees of freedom do our leaders have, and what would they do if they could exercise them?
You're at least half agreeing with something that I think Mark and Deb both said, which would boil down to just get better leaders for these agencies, and they can bust the cages or persuade others to do so for them. That's what they more or less both said, and you're semi-agreeing.
To an extent, but go back to, I think, the great example of the long list of state takeovers of districts and schools by SEAs. I mean, this goes back to Paul Vallis and many others in New Jersey. They've been taking over districts for 20 years. Happened in Cleveland, Seattle, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Detroit. They're bold state leaders who said, I have a moral obligation to take over, enter a list of failing urban districts. But then once they took it over, they were like the dog who chased the car and caught it and said, okay, now what do I do with it? Here I am located in Lansing, and yet Detroit is quite a hike away. How am I going to manage the system? So the question isn't that there weren't bold leaders in place. It's that what is the SEA actually going to do to make Detroit public schools any better? What you needed is a new institution like the RSD, like the ASD, like the EEA in Michigan, a new institution with new practices, with new policies, with a new mindset that's able to get this stuff done. I mean, bad institutions eat good people for lunch. And I think we can't underestimate the ability of the sclerosis, the 100 years of practice of beliefs, the DNA that's been built up over 50 years of what an SEA does. And when you go there and say, let's do things differently, the number of forces against you saying, no, this is how we do it, non-trivial.
So comments, and then we're going to open it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have a responsibility as public officials to not just give up on the organizations that we run, but to make every possible improvement that we can. But there's no question that when there's work that needs to be done, that we're not the best folks to do it, that someone else should do it. And I think those examples that you just gave are great examples of where it could probably be done more effectively.
And I think these examples are growing. If we look at the last 3, 4, 5 years, we're seeing many more examples of partnerships. They're not only with outside organizations, but they're partnerships between the LEAs and the SEAs. And these are really productive partnerships based around outcomes that we should be proud of.
So maybe along those lines, there's a figure 4 on page 29 where we did what we thought was our first cut of what are the things, current activities that might fall into the control, contract, cleave, and create. Maybe this is wrong, it's a first draft. Maybe there needs to be a thoughtful conversation where Deb or Mark would say, listen, you ought to move some things from cleave or contract back into control, or shift things around. Maybe we overestimated the problems of the SEA, and the SEA can do some things. I just won't concede that everything ought to be in the control category.
And I think they're agreeing with you on that.
So let's call it quits. We agree.
Well, I don't agree with everything on the chart, but
No,
I agree in principle.
Yes, and I think Andy's...
Where is this chart? Page 21.
Not in my
21.
copy, but I think
It's
everybody...
figure 4.
Can everybody find the chart that in your copy is on page 21?
Yes.
And in your copy is somewhere else, but you got an earlier copy? All right. So, but I think the point isn't to find the chart. It's that I think Andy just invited a further conversation about which items belong on that list and which items belong on the other lists. And we won't have that entire conversation right now. What we are going to do instead is invite a wider participation from our... Whoa.
Enthusiasm, that's good.
Eagerness is excellent. Bust our cage. But we are going to... have 3 kinds of questions. We're going to have studio audience questions. We're going to have, if there's anybody tweeting from the worldwide audience, they can. We will have tweeted questions, which somebody will bring me. But we're actually, Joe, pay attention. We're actually going to start with a pre-recorded video question from Ashley Jocham at the Center for Research on Reforming or Renewing or whatever it is, Public Education at the University of Washington in Seattle. Let's see what she asked of Andy and the panel. Joe.
Hi, Andy. This is Ashley Jocham at the Center on Reinventing Public Education here in Seattle, Washington. Thanks for the opportunity to read this interesting paper. You present two competing visions for SEAs, in my opinion. On the one hand, you suggest SEAs should focus on compliance monitoring and leave the hard work of reform to nonprofits and the private sector. On the other hand, you suggest SEAs need to take the helm, set the direction of reform, and manage the performance of other organizations via contracts, including school districts. How do you reconcile these competing visions, and what do they imply for the need for talent in the SEA?
The tension between the two, which I guess at least not immediately, I'm seeing.
We can delay your answer if you wish.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that if you put an organization like a charter authorizer in the position of saying, this is what we want, this is what we think it looks like, you apply to do those things. We will monitor your performance based on the criteria that we have laid out. So by virtue of doing that, you are setting your priorities. You're saying what success looks like. You're engaging others to do the work. You're monitoring them. You're making a go, no-go decision on the front end and on the back end. And then just through that process over time, you make sure the stuff you want gets done. So the State Department of Education is doing less rowing. The analog for the district is it's running less schools. It's just enabling schools to be run. Here it's doing less of the service provision. It's ensuring services are provided. But I'll think more about it.
Okay, think more about it. All right, so the worldwide or intergalactic audience can start tweeting, but the studio audience has mics that are going to circulate thanks to Fordham's able interns. I know a few of you at site, but I don't know everybody, so you're going to have to introduce yourself. Make it a question, make it brief, make it pointed. And why don't you give this lady, this very, very eager woman, the microphone. Who are you?
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the
Wait a minute, I'm not sure it's on.
I don't know how to do that.
Real close to your mouth?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess it's working.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I have to explain that John Delaware is my godfather, so I come with a particular set of views to this. I was involved in reinventing government. In the Defense Department when that was over. What was clear is nobody understood how the processes worked. And there's a new book out right now called Fragile by Design. And I think all of our big bureaucratic organizations suffer from that. When I got to the Pentagon...
You're going to ask a question, right? Not just tell an anecdote.
Well, my question is, how are you going to map the processes so other people can come in and understand what needs to be done? And I sort of keep thinking these would be great theses for kids to do in college to come and look at this. But if you don't know... When I was at the Pentagon, I had to figure out how to be a snake going through a stone wall in order to get the work done.
All right, that's quite an image. So I think, this boils down to the implementation of your recommendations will require quite a lot of heavy lifting in its own right.
That's right. Yeah, so the way we think about these kinds of papers are, we thought we identified a problem, we came up with a hypothesis for the way for it to be solved. We were lucky enough to see that this incubating ecosystem was actually kind of forming, so at least on one level we're happy that someone and others were ahead of us. Whether that succeeds, where it goes, to be determined. Phase 2 of this work is, without sort of hawking my wares here, I would love to work with CCSSO or with Deb or with Mark or other state chiefs to actually turn this into a playbook and wrestle with the tough problems of how do you actually get right the problems with contracting and not having sole source and making sure that there's not nepotism, or deciding what things should be contracted out and which should exist just in the department itself. So my hope coming out of this is all of you, if you came in thinking everything's fine with the SEA, just beef it up, that many of you leave saying maybe that's not the only answer, that we ought to think about the dispersal of authority, and now you're wondering how it can get done, and then Julie and I, if she's willing to continue working with me, we'll go to phase 2, which is implementation.
So assuming that he's actually willing to do this for free and is not seeking
for
bellwether, are you willing to invite him into your state to meet with yourself and your brain trusts about how this might be done more and better?
100% willing. I think Nancy's point around mapping the processes is really important. We're seeing significant shifts in the way that education is being delivered, and if we are unable to capture those shifts and unable to capture the lessons learned along the way, then we're not doing a service to the people who are leading this work 5, 10, 15 years from now. And so I think this is an exciting opportunity to capture what's working about these changes.
Does he need a visa for Rhode Island?
Absolutely not. You're welcome anytime, Andy.
Thank you.
Okay, next is you, but it's clear the microphone doesn't actually help the people in the room. So you're going to have to speak loudly enough that we can hear you.
Good morning, Mark Elgard,
Now it's
Advance
helping
Ed.
the people in the room. We've
At the
changed
beginning,
our
you
sound
talked.
system. Say again, you are?
Mark Elgard, Advance Ed. At the beginning, you talked about the governance of our public school system. What was not mentioned this morning was the consistent rotation of our state chiefs. There's no stabilization in leadership in our states. What's the policy solution there? We have to stabilize state leadership, and you have 2 examples of state leaders who've been in their roles to see through reform change.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I remember a conversation just a couple years ago with David Driscoll, who was going down the list of state chiefs at the time. And I believe he said to me that with 1 or maximum 2 exceptions on the list, the longest lasting chiefs on the list had been in place for 4 years. There were a couple of people who have been doing what they were doing for 37 years or something, but not many. So what about the stability question?
I mean,
You're stable, but what about the system, the structure?
It's absolutely crucial. I actually, if you look at the list of chiefs, I think I'm the 4th longest serving chief, which is, that tells you right there. I hope I don't look that old. So that tells you right there, you know, that there's a lot of turnover. There's no question about that. I think it's a couple things. I mean, I think that we, you know, part of it is just a function of public appointees. And I think to the extent that we could work with folks who are running for offices, gubernatorial candidates, to consider that just having turnover, this not necessarily ought to be a knee-jerk reaction all the time, because consistency does matter. That's one of the things we know about systems that improve over time. They have consistency of leadership. But I also think that those of us who are in these jobs have to have a commitment to sticking with it for the long haul. And there are moments when you're about 3 or 4 years in where it gets really, really hard. And I think that's the moment in which we have to have the commitment to see it through to beyond that point.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. If we assume that we're not going to solve the longevity issue, at least in the short term, then I think that we as leaders have to take a couple of orientations in the work. And the first has got to be that you have to take an orientation towards groundswell and towards engagement and empowerment amongst the people in the communities. Because if it's just on one person's back, then that person's easily professionally assassinated, or that person leaves and the initiative is over. And so there has to be an orientation towards that. And then the second piece is there has to be an orientation towards institutionalizing some of these policies or practices. And so for example, we were able to pass a Senate bill last year that helped to institutionalize significant changes in educator preparation that will live for many years to come. Now that is dependent on the quality of the implementation of those practices, but at least it's been institutionalized, and there is really strong support through state board and regs and also through code. So those 2 orientations, I think, help. One of the key questions I had when reading Andy's paper is this question around how long does it take to create the type of ecosystem that he is describing, especially that create portion. If that doesn't exist, I think it's years to create that sort of ecosystem, at least in a way where that ecosystem can function relatively efficiently with broad stakeholder engagement. And sometimes our states don't see years of consistent leadership.
So because there's empirical evidence on this that is troubling for a disruptor like me who thinks, let's blow things up and start over. And I mean,
never say blow up. Every time I've ever used that phrase, I've been accused of wanting to kill children.
Okay. Substantially alter the order of things.
Okay.
Okay. A couple years ago, Paul Peterson and his colleagues wrote this really interesting report showing that the states that made the biggest gains on NAEP over the past 20 years, the 20 years they looked at, happened to be Massachusetts, Florida, and Maryland. The striking thing about all three, Nancy Grasmick was the state superintendent in Maryland for all 20 years. Massachusetts, it is now famous after their 1993 Education Reform Act. They had consistency in, regardless of the party of the governor or the appointee for the state commissioner, they all agreed on the 1993 Reform Act and implemented with fidelity. In Florida, you can say the same thing. Various commissioners, but all different governors believed in it. So there seems to be something to be said for this. And even Michael Barber just wrote this report, like kind of the 2.0 version of the MBAE report that led to the 1993 Act, where he kind of makes the case if Massachusetts wants to lead for the next 20 years, they need to kind of follow the last 20 years. This is not sexy. This is not sort of avant-garde. It's, you know, nose to the grindstone, have a vision, faithfully implement it. And I am kind of concerned, going back to Rick Hess's book from eons ago, Spinning Wheels, that going back to the dog kind of chasing whatever is like shiny and new in front of it, I think we do damage when we don't have consistency. And I think Deb and hopefully Mark stick around for a long time so they can prove this out. But you're right, it happens too seldom. And I'll say, I think Deborah's point on this is exactly right. After 2, 3, 4 years, the small incremental scars, the cuts that you're getting over time from budget committees and the governor's office and editorial boards and just all the obstacles can weigh on you. The people who can break through that, I have much more faith in now. So
we got several tweeted questions, and you'll notice our high-tech system for getting them up to me. A couple of them I actually think the panel has already answered, but one that I think we haven't even gotten near. And I'm also looking at several people in the audience with this question from somebody named David Doty. Can the panel talk about the limitations placed on SEA leaders by the politics of elected boards? And I think that specifically refers to the states where the state board is an elected body. And I don't know whether that's true in either of your cases. In Ohio, where we do a lot of work, with the amalgam state board is half elected and half appointed, creating its own bizarre dynamics sometimes. But what about the elected boards and the politics of that as a constraint on chiefs?
Well, I worked with an elected board when I was in DC, and you know, there's certainly a bit of a difference. They have constituents that they have to respond to, and so they're very responsive to the public. But ideally, we want to all be responsive to the public. So the question is whether or not we're focusing them on the right things and engaging people in productive conversations, rather than getting caught up in, you know, sort of unproductive politics. You know, I have a state board of education that is appointed, and I think yours is appointed as well.
By the governor.
By the governor, yeah. And I think that any board they're coming with their own sets of priorities and so forth. So any board you're going to have to manage, and it's about relationships, it's about information, it's about being clear about what you're trying to accomplish and leading them forward in a way that helps them to understand and brings them together as a team and has that kind of commitment that Mark was talking about that grows from when you really engage people in a meaningful way. And it's very hard to do, especially when people have competing priorities or different reasons for having wanted to assume that responsibility, but they have a really important role to play, so it's critical that we do it well.
Do you serve at the pleasure of your board or the pleasure of the governor?
Pleasure of the board.
And what about you?
Governor.
The governor, okay. How is your board comprised? Or do you have one?
Yes, we have a state board, and I see them as incredibly strong partners, and I don't want to understate the importance of aligned leadership, right, between my office, the governor, and the state board. And I think that aligned leadership has to come with a real orientation towards being a critical friend and pushing and debating, but alignment of leadership matters for getting things done.
Yeah, and it's not just having lived through a state superintendent we had a board, but he served at the pleasure of the governor. I jotted down in recent memory, so John White, currently in Louisiana, although appointed by the board, board's appointed by the governor, he has now gotten crosswise with the governor, Governor Jindal, on Common Core and common assessments.
Governor Jindal's gotten crosswise with him in the last 2 weeks.
Yes. Kevin Huffman in Tennessee, pushing hard for Park and Common Core. The governor, I think for political reasons, had to make a decision that went the other way. Recently in Texas, there was a, let's say, contretemps between the chief and the governor. In Florida, we saw this between Eric Smith and the incoming governor. So it's not just elected state boards, it's the tension when you have a state chief who wants to push in a direction, and for political reasons, whether he directly reports to the governor or through the board to the governor, that is a very, very real set of political circumstances that I wouldn't wish upon someone. It takes a special person to be able to navigate that. It's a problem.
So regardless of the particular structure of the state, there's sort of 4 moving parts here. There's a governor, there's a legislature, there's a state board of education, and there's a state chief. And some of them are appointed, elected, et cetera. But alignment would, perfect alignment would have to involve all 4, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't know how realistic perfect alignment is for any length of time.
Okay.
So I don't think we should definitely not say that alignment is needed to make great progress for kids.
Okay.
I mean, I think I agreed with Mark's point about the alignment being important, but if you'd have to work with the whatever setting you're put into, you have to work with that setting. And I think that part of the reason we've been successful in keeping our work going in Rhode Island is that we worked as a state to develop the plan, the 5-year plan that we're implementing. We're about to start a new plan, and we want to do even more engagement this time. Because to Mark's point, when this can't be about one person or one governor or whatnot. It has to be something that people are committed to in a broader way. We've been really fortunate that we've had support from leadership in our General Assembly, our governor, and we've worked hard to ensure that our state board understands and is supportive of what we're all trying to accomplish together.
Okay, Reg, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yes, Reggie Felton, National School Boards Association. Andy, implied in your opening statement was sort of either there'd be a lot more money, or at least more money, or shifted money, and the idea that by setting up these partners, for-profit or non-profit, there'd more likelihood of additional philanthropy. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about why you believe that, and how even state education agencies would be in the position to make major shifts of funding, given that they're already under-resourced?
So I know from just New Jersey's experience, if the New Jersey Department of Education wanted to receive a philanthropic grant, the state board had to approve it, meaning the money had to come through the department, be approved, both the amount and its expenditure level, and then the department had to do with it according to procurement rules and so forth. Many foundations just don't want to deal with that. It's way too burdensome for them, and just once you get your money into the public process, their transparency and then their timeline delays and so forth. So I lived this actually in a number of cases. The ability of these nonprofit 501c3s to be partners of the department, to say that we know that we can execute better on Common Core implementation or on teacher eval or teacher preparation or whatever it might be. There are lots of foundations who think increasingly that the state is the lever to get big things done related to human capital, related to standards and assessments. That I think that my prediction is if we see a proliferation in the types of organizations like the Colorado Education Initiative, like the New York Regents Fund and things like that, we're going to see more philanthropic money flow to the state level, and that those state level dollars are going to do much more to advance the work, especially given that in Rhode Island and Delaware, both race to the top winning states, those dollars are, if not totally gone, they're going to be gone soon. And so there's going to be, if not...
Delaware is going to take a while.
If not a cliff, there's going to be, let's see, a slow ramp off. And so I think a lot of philanthropists are going to say, the work at the state level needs to continue. I don't want to give my money directly to the state for all of these reasons. If I can have a nonprofit partner that I trust to work with Deborah, or to work with Mark, or to work with John King or John White, I'm willing to do that. That's my prediction. And so although the department may not directly control every dollar, if they have a good partnership like the CEI does for governance reasons with the partner, they'll be able to get a whole lot more done. That's my hope.
A lot of funders just don't want to give their philanthropic dollars to a government agency. They just don't. It's just right. They're allergic to giving private dollars to the government, other than through the taxes they pay. Speaking of the CEI, we have, if Joe will tee it up, our other video question from Helene Jones, who is part of the Colorado Education Initiative. So let's see what she has on her mind.
We are asking more of state education agencies than we ever have before. This question is for the state chiefs. In what ways do you see an independent organization working with you to identify innovation in your state and to effectively implement major reforms to increase student achievement?
Please make that stop. Thank you. I think she was very modestly asking if you have organizations in your states like hers.
I can give a great example, actually, and this is one of the quibbles I had with the recommendation. So innovation was, I think, a primary thing where, SEI, I agree with the point that the SEA is probably not, you wouldn't assume is the best place for innovation to happen. But in Rhode Island, there is a lot of innovation happening right now around digital learning. And it's happening very organically. People, teachers and school districts all are doing this incredible work. But I believe that we played a really important role in kicking that off because we got some private funding that we didn't accept. We worked through the Rhode Island Foundation to put in place to give out to our schools, to do model schools, to do professional development and really get that started. And now it's growing like wildfire. And to answer Helene's question, the organization within our state is an organization called the Highlander Institute. It was for a very long time had been an organization that really worked on literacy education. And they've gotten involved with blended learning and become, I believe, a national leader in this work and are now getting private funding that I don't believe Rhode Island would have ever attracted before, and doing some amazing work supporting teachers and school districts in Rhode Island to consider how technology can help them to personalize instruction for students.
Mark?
I would add that the ideas that Helene puts forward and that Andy put forward are really exciting. So we've got lots of people we're contracting with to one of the Cs, and that contracting has gotten better. We've gotten better at our own contracting practices. We've seen the marketplace get more exciting and more nimble. So for example, we've got people approaching us now who want to join together in contracting with us to provide better services. So Double Line and Great Schools partnering together, Delaware Academy of School Leadership partnering with new leaders. So you wind up with multiple people trying to serve, which is really exciting. It still puts the SEA in the place to manage the contract and to do all the performance management associated with that. If there's an external organization that say was focused on school leadership, for example, and was managing 5 or 6 or 7 different initiatives in partnership with us, I think that would be a really powerful model because they could develop a core competency around school leadership as well as around the contracting processes, and that then takes that work out of the SEA and assumes that they can be more nimble, and then we can work in alignment with them. I think these are exciting opportunities. A question that hasn't come up in the last hour is, how do you create these types of organizations and who's going to create them?
That was one of the tweeted questions. So if you have some thoughts on the creation of, either express them now or save them up for a few minutes.
I'd love to hear the thoughts.
You have had, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you've had sort of a general partner in Delaware in the Rhode Foundation, haven't you?
Yes, absolutely. So Rhode in some ways has played this type of role. They've played a number of different roles, and they're primarily, I would characterize the roles as partnership and critical friend type roles, but also as people who are trying to cultivate an environment of other nonprofits to support the work that is going on around the a state. So yes, I don't think that they're not a direct correlation to some of the examples Andy painted, but certainly fall into the same camp.
Okay, Mike Houston, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Mike Houston,
and be brief.
The Institute for Education Leaders. Just very briefly, it's a very provocative paper, but my question essentially is, piggybacking on Mark's point, isn't it already happening to a large degree? The number of contracts that the WestEds, the AIRs, the Advanced Eds have. I mean, it seems to be happening all over the country already, and I didn't have the opportunity to read the paper, but I assume there are numerous examples of this. So what you're proposing is not far-fetched. I mean, it's happening, and a paper like this could be a catalyst to move it along.
So are you looking backward or forward?
No, I'd like to think we're looking forward. So I think Race to the Top, one of its many benefits is showing that states like these and other leading states got a substantial influx of money. And I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but even New Jersey, which got a tenth of what we had originally applied for, we found ourselves having a whole lot of money and not being able to ramp up internally quickly. So it forced us to think about how do we contract, how do we partner with a bunch of different organizations to get this work done. But even at that point, and this is something Julie and I have talked a whole lot about, even if we move towards the contracting model, antiquated rules related to hiring and procurement and purchasing can take what should be in the private sector a 2-week process, may take 9 months in the state of New Jersey, and I don't know what your processes are like. So what I've been thinking more about increasingly is there some way to get around those rules that the state has in place without getting rid of the important pieces of them? Transparency, making sure nepotism doesn't exist. So in effect, having procurement, contracting work through one of these CEI-like nonprofit organizations that agrees just through MOU or just good practice to decide we don't have to do all these transparency things, but we're going to, because in effect, these are public dollars going for public goods. So I think what I would say is the lessons we've learned are good ones, and they have informed me in such a way that we can't continue what we're doing. We should learn from them, but shift them, I think, to the nonprofit sector, especially given that some of this Race to the Top money is going away and we're not going to have as much as we had in the past.
Just briefly, you keep using the word nonprofit, and
yeah.
I think I understand why, but actually for any of you, does the for-profit sector also have a role to play here, or are you wary of it, or it all depends?
Okay, full disclosure, there is tension maybe among the team here who wrote this paper on this, and I think there's tension within the...
Well, Julie is probably right, and you're probably...
Well, as a general rule, I think that is right. I think, and this is just straight realpolitik here, it's much easier to say nonprofit when we're talking about contracting out services than for-profit. A whole lot of people immediately will shut down when you think about contracting if there are money-grubbing for-profiteers and, sort of everything else that goes along with that. That's why in my discussion I tried to talk about a largely non-government sector, but with government actors like the Recovery School District. I'm totally open to there being some organizations that are for-profit working in this space. So we talk about, Julie, if you don't mind chiming in, there's the Achievement Network, which does a wide range of professional development, technical assistance, which is a non-profit, but there's an analog that does for-profit that we talked about. What's that? SchoolNet, something like that. So yeah, I would never want to put aside or just put the kibosh on any non-profit, so a for-profit organization. I just think we all have to be cognizant of the radioactivity of saying that there are going to be profiteers in this business.
There are also money-grubbing nonprofits, of course.
I know.
Has anybody been to the ETS campus lately?
Yeah.
Just as one example. Do you all do work with for-profit groups as well as nonprofit groups? Does it matter?
Well, of course. I mean, I think that one of the things that's always interesting about the for-profit conversation is that we ignore conveniently the years and decades that we've all worked with for-profit textbook companies and publishing companies and food service delivery people and custodial service, whatever it is, that's been, it's been something that's happened for a very long time. I think there's reasonable caution about it, and we should always be very careful to make sure that as much of the funding as possible is going directly into services for students and not into profits for other people. But, you know, ultimately what matters most is that we're getting the highest quality service that we can.
Agreed?
Completely.
But remember the philanthropic angle. If these are philanthropic dollars,
They won't go to for-profits.
because
No,
you
I
only get
understand that.
the money, the
Okay.
deduction if you go nonprofit.
You, or who?
Ace Parsi from NASB. So my question to you is regarding following a comprehensive vision so that not all programs are going in different directions. It seems like there's a natural advantage for state education agencies that manage several programs to make sure that all those are following one comprehensive vision. But when you outsource that to multiple different agencies, it becomes less likely to be able to do that, as each of them might have their own interests. Can you address how all these different, when you outsource it to multiple different institutions, how you can make sure that that's still following one comprehensive vision for college career and civic success for students?
Sure.
Sort of a dispersion problem, maybe.
Yeah, sure. I'll give two quick thoughts on that. One is, as long as the state sets a vision at 10,000, 30,000 feet, let's say, let's well implement Common Core in English language arts reading over the next 5 years. That is a vision. It can set up a wide array of organizations that go about that work in different ways, just like there are lots of different ways to implement a new teacher evaluation system. But you set a goal. We want to make sure that there is true differentiation in the evaluations of teachers and that there are true consequences. There are many ways to skin that cat. So the state sets the goal as loosely as possible, allowing there to be differentiation in services, hopefully all paths leading to the ultimate goal. But the piece that we didn't talk about that we really emphasize in the paper is that too often we talk about this sort of supply side of services and not the demand side. Something that Julie and I were really quite high on is the idea of, in New Jersey, when we were talking about implementing a teacher evaluation system, what is needed in Newark or in Camden to very low-income urban districts is very different than what's needed in Mendham or maybe even Cherry Hill outside of Camden, outside of Philadelphia. So as long as the state sets the vision, says what the goal is, and you have a range of providers, then you actually empower districts and schools to say, you know, that's not really for us, I want to try this thing. And my experience is that districts are often parochial for good reason. They say our needs, our teachers, our community need something different than that community over there. And I just think the dispersion, the differentiation in possible service providers does a whole lot more to getting to your goal than the one best system that I and Chris Surf or Deb, as brilliant as she is. I mean, her state is diverse. I think you get to your final goal a whole lot better if you have who is a Supreme Court justice who talked about the laboratories of democracy.
Brandeis.
I mean, the same thing works at the state level. You set a goal, but then you allow in New Jersey the 600 plus districts to kind of figure it out themselves. So I think the state can set a vision, use dispersion of different sources, and kind of cull as the process goes along to figure out what's working.
Sounds right to me. You?
I would agree with that. I just add that there are incentives built into the system for people to be aligned. Mm-hmm. So if there's outside organizations that are leading a certain type of work, if they wind up misaligned with the state's vision or the vision, the broader vision, then there's a risk for them to be marginalized. So I think the incentives and the pressures in the system are for alignment.
We are in our final minutes. I could handle one last quick question if anybody in the room has one. Right there.
Hi, I'm Steve Glazerman from Mathematica Policy Research. Love to hear the panelists talk a little bit about the SEA role in research. Tom Kane had a recent Brookings Institution piece on SEA's underinvesting in education. So I guess the question for this panel would be, is he right? And what would be the mechanism for, or what would your ideal configuration be for how that kind of work gets done?
An eminent nonprofit research organization would like to know if state agencies are doing enough research.
I would say that there's no question that there is not enough research in K-12 education generally. The role of the state education agency in that, I think, should be one of as a partner. I mean, I think that we have, in our agency, we have a very small data office that does some research in the sense of making sense of data so that we can do our job better and we can provide supports to districts in that. But but not the kind of research that you all do or that I think Tom was talking about. And we've been very fortunate to be able to partner with a number of others around that kind of research, including institutions of higher education and different kinds of policy think tanks. And so being available to that, being open to that, sharing data appropriately and so forth, I think is important, and we definitely need more research.
Completely agree with that, and would add that the state education agency is uniquely positioned to build the longitudinal data systems and get the data right. And so we've had the opportunity to partner with the Harvard Strategic Data Project and Data Quality Campaign and Dell and a variety of others to get those longitudinal data systems to where they be, and then to allow the research to happen. I don't think that we are uniquely positioned to do the research, but we are certainly uniquely positioned to set up data systems.
I agree with that, but I'm very nervous about SEAs doing their own research. I mean, and I have to say this from firsthand experience, I don't trust SEAs to evaluate the efficacy of the programs that they have advocated for, implemented, and have a whole big interest in.
But you would say that about any entity, evaluating its own self.
Precisely, and that's why IES and PPSS in the U.S. Department of Education, especially IES, the firewall between what they do and the department itself is meaningful, and why I was so frustrated when the NAEP results, the tutor results came out so recently. It felt like that firewall had come down, and the results were not nearly as, let's say, dispassionate as they probably should be. As the spin. So I think collecting the data, making it available, but doing it itself, iffy.
That's a good point. Why don't you all join me in thanking everybody here. Andy and Julie for a great paper and provocative, and Deb and Mark for a terrific panel. This has been great. Thank you for coming, and come back soon. We keep doing these things.
Thanks, everyone.
I don't know how you can change the people.
Thanks.
Thank you.